6.3 million years ago, the African continent was alive with danger and motion. Massive beasts roamed the plains. Thick forests concealed predators. The earth trembled beneath stampeding herds and echoed with the cries of survival. This world was not made for the weak. Somewhere in this untamed land, a new kind of creature had begun to emerge. It wasn't the strongest. It wasn't the fastest. But it had one advantage others lacked, a mind slowly waking up. These were the early hominins, small, upright, and uncertain. They lived between the trees and the open land, never truly safe in either. Their arms still long for climbing, their legs slowly adapting to walking upright. They were not yet human, but something had changed. They feared the same threats every animal did: saber-toothed cats, venomous snakes, hunger, drought. But fear wasn't the only thing rising in them. In moments of desperation, they didn't just flee, they resisted. When a mother's infant was threatened, she didn't just hide, she stood her ground. When a rival approached to steal food, the group didn't scatter, they pushed back. There was something new happening in their emotional world, a response beyond instinct, a flash of emotion that would come to define human nature. Anger. This was not rage as we know it today. It was raw and unshaped. But it burned in the body and sharpened reactions. It created strength where there was weakness. It fueled courage where there was fear. These early ancestors began to rely on one another, not out of affection, but necessity. They learned that facing threats as a group increased their odds. Alone, they were prey. Together, they had a chance. And as group living became more consistent, emotions deepened. Disputes over food or shelter led to tension. Some groups clashed when their paths crossed. These conflicts may have started with noise, vocalizations, body displays, gestures, but they sometimes escalated into physical confrontation. It's not just survival of the fittest, survival of the angriest. In their world, everything was earned through struggle. Food was fought for, space was defended. The right to mate was contested. These confrontations taught early hominins something no other creature on Earth had quite mastered: how to channel fury. They began to anticipate danger. They remembered past threats. They recognized which rivals were aggressive and which could be avoided. And over time, these responses shaped their minds. They didn't just react. They began to predict. Anger turned into awareness. Awareness turned into planning. These were the first steps toward emotional intelligence. Even as their bodies remained primitive, their social structures became more complex. Small groups, probably no more than a dozen individuals, began to form basic social bonds. Within these groups, power began to shift. Not necessarily to the strongest, but to those who could intimidate, protect, or control. Emotional power started to matter. Older members might have been respected for their experience. Younger members learned through observation. And when danger came, it wasn't always the physically dominant who led. Sometimes it was the boldest, the loudest, the most fearless. This was the slow shaping of hierarchy. Fury became a force that earned attention. It created roles within the group. It created fear. It demanded respect. Meanwhile, nature continued its endless trial. Environments shifted, rainforests dried, grasslands expanded, and with every change, early hominins had to adapt or perish. Sometimes they did both. Their survival was not a guarantee, but it was fueled by determination. When they were pushed from one region to another, they learned the terrain. When they were starved by drought, they sought new sources. When they were hunted, they found new ways to hide or defend. They hadn't yet invented tools. They hadn't yet harnessed fire, but they had developed something equally powerful: the emotional foundation that would one day lead to both. As infants cried and mothers comforted them, as rivals fought and groups scattered, as survivors grieved there, lost and moved forward, something was growing inside the human mind. A storm of emotions: fear, joy, loss, and fury. That fury wasn't mindless violence. It was the seed of resistance, the beginning of protest. refusal to accept defeat in a world that offered no mercy. And so life 6.3 million years ago was not peaceful, it was not noble, it was not wise, but it was awakening. The ancestors of humanity were beginning to rise, not because they had conquered nature, but because they had started to fight back. Not only with teeth and fists, but with feeling. The fire of intelligence had not yet been lit, but the fuel was gathering, and within every early scream of defiance, in every bold stance against danger, in every stubborn refusal to run, there was the birth of something new, something entirely human, the birth of fury. The spark of emotion had begun. But what followed was not a calm evolution, it was a storm as the environment changed. So did the pressure on early hominins. Seasons shifted unpredictably. Water became harder to find. Prey moved and predators followed. This constant instability forced one thing: adaptation or extinction. And adaptation didn't come from muscle alone. It came from something brewing. Deep in the mind, the drive to resist, to defend, and to take what was needed came from fury, sharpened, shaped, and redirected. Small bands of early hominins became more mobile. They learned to read their surroundings, notice patterns, recognize signs of danger or opportunity. And when they were denied what they needed, they didn't just retreat, they competed. They fought for survival with new intensity, at watering holes. They waited in tension, not just watching for lions or crocodiles, but for rival groups. Access to water meant power. And any challenge to that access was met with confrontation. It could start with warning calls, aggressive posture, even stone throwing. They were no longer passive victims of the land. They were becoming defenders. Of territory, even within groups, emotions became tools. Disagreements were no longer settled by strength alone. Those who could manipulate emotion through displays, intimidation, or loyalty began to lead. The seeds of leadership and dominance behavior took root, shaped not by logic, but by feeling. The earliest forms of social punishment may have begun here. Those who broke trust or disrupted harmony faced consequences: rejection, aggression, exclusion. These were primitive rules, but they were powerful. They helped early humans understand one truth: survival wasn't just about endurance, it was about social intelligence. And at the center of that intelligence was anger, not chaos, but control. Not blind rage, but strategic fury. Across generations, those who could wield emotion survived longer, reproduced more, and passed on their traits. The brain grew slowly, but purposefully. New pathways formed. Emotional brain, the limbic system, became more sensitive, more reactive, more useful. With this emotional growth came memory. Early hominins began to remember more clearly, not just places, but events. They could recall threats, losses, victories. Memory gave emotion weight. With memory came something even more human: revenge. If a group lost a member to a rival band, they might avoid that band in the future, or they might retaliate. These actions weren't random. They were fueled by something that lingered long after the moment passed: the emotional echo of pain and anger. This echo was powerful. It pushed early humans to act, not just for survival, but for justice. And justice, however primitive, meant protecting the group, asserting dominance, preserving resources. Around this time, hominins began experimenting with objects in new ways. Stones weren't just for throwing. Branches weren't just obstacles, they were potential tools. Emotion drove experimentation. Frustration with hunger, desperation during a hunt, fury in a fight, all of it led to innovation. The first shaped stones may have been born out of emotional necessity. A cut, a scrape, a strike, all small but meaningful steps toward the tools of the future. Not invention through calm thought, but through urgency and stress. These weren't inventions of the mind alone. They were products of survival pressure. Born in the heat of the moment, born in fury, as the world around them remained brutal, early humans became more resourceful. They began to move across longer distances, following prey or fleeing danger. This mobility required planning, a skill linked to the very emotions that had helped them survive. A group that had once scattered at the first sign of danger now responded with strategy. One member might distract a predator while others secured an escape route. These behaviors weren't taught in schools, were passed on through experience, trial, error, and emotion. Young ones watched their elders. They learned not just how to move, but when to fight, when to flee, and when to stand their ground. They learned that fear and anger were not weaknesses. They were tools. And how those tools were used often meant the difference between life and death. Even sleep became dangerous. Fires hadn't yet been controlled, so nightfall brought predators in cold. But the emotional bonds between group members created new habits, watching over one another. Alertness in shifts, collective protection. Trust was born not from logic, but from shared fear. And shared fury when that trust was broken. Slowly, this emotional landscape became the foundation of something entirely new: culture. Not yet music or art, but behavior. Shared ways of responding, shared understanding, foundation for language, even though words had not yet formed. And within that foundation, emotion was king. Fury created loyalty. It defined enemies. It demanded justice. It shaped memory, drove decisions, and forged alliances. It made hominins more than animals. It made them ancestral humans by 6.3 million. Years ago, these emotions were not yet refined, but they were powerful. They dictated survival, death, reproduction, and group identity. The world had not grown safer. It had simply grown more complicated. And early humans met that complexity with something just as complex. The beginning of the emotional mind. The journey ahead would take millions more years. But already the first great transformation had begun, from instinct to emotion, from reaction to intention, from prey to defender, from silence to fury. This was not just the survival of the species. This was the birth of something fierce, something enduring, something entirely human, the birth of human fury.